What happens when royal entitlement meets unfiltered American television? What unfolds when Prince Harry tries to lecture one of comedy's most ruthless voices about American politics and gets served a reality check he'll never forget? You won't believe what transpired last night on Real Time with Bill Maher when the Duke of Sussex walked into what can only be described as a verbal massacre that ended with security escorting him off the set. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when royal privilege crashes headfirst into Maher's trademark brutal honesty. The evening started innocuously enough, with Prince Harry arriving at the HBO studios in Burbank looking every bit the polished royal he's cultivated since his move to California. Dressed in his signature casual but expensive ensemble, the Duke appeared confident as he settled into the guest chair opposite Maher, clearly expecting the kind of softball treatment he's grown accustomed to from American media outlets eager to court royal favor. Maher, however, had other plans. From the moment the cameras rolled, there was a palpable tension in the air that even the studio audience seemed to sense. The comedian's opening monologue had been particularly sharp that evening, touching on everything from celebrity activism to the ongoing culture wars, and those familiar with Maher's style knew he was in one of his moods where no sacred cow would be spared. So Harry, Maher began with that deceptively casual tone that regular viewers know precedes his most devastating takedowns. You've been quite vocal about American politics lately. Tell me, what gives a guy who grew up in palaces the authority to lecture Americans about inequality? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry's carefully practiced media smile flickered for just a moment. Well, Bill, I think having a platform comes with responsibility. Meghan and I believe in using our voices to advocate for change, especially when it comes to social justice issues that affect communities here in America. Maher leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to that familiar smirk that signals he's about to pounce. Right, but here's what I find fascinating. You literally lived off taxpayer money for decades in a system built on hereditary privilege, and now you're in America telling us how to fix our problems? It's like having Marie Antoinette give seminars on budgeting. The studio audience's laughter was immediate and sharp, but Harry's response revealed the first crack in his composed facade. His jaw tightened slightly, and his voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there moments before. I think that's quite unfair, Bill. My military service, my charitable work, my personal experiences with loss and trauma, these things give me perspective that I believe is valuable. Military service, absolutely, I respect that. Maher conceded, but his tone suggested a but was coming. However, let's be honest about what your military service looked like versus what it looks like for regular Americans. You had round-the-clock security, specially designed missions, and a PR team managing your image. Meanwhile, American veterans are sleeping on the streets because they can't get proper health care or housing assistance. So when you talk about service, are we really talking about the same thing? The question hit harder than Harry had expected, and his media training seemed to desert him for a moment. That's a gross oversimplification of my experience. I served alongside incredible men and women. I faced real danger, and I've spent years working with veterans through the Invictus Games and other initiatives. Maher's eyes lit up with the kind of predatory gleam that meant he smelled blood in the water. Oh, the Invictus Games, right. Let me ask you this. How much of your charity work is actually about helping people versus rehabilitating your image after some pretty spectacular public relations disasters? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've turned victimhood into a very lucrative brand. The words hit the studio like a thunderclap, and the audience's reaction was immediate. A mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and the kind of uncomfortable silence that comes when someone says what everyone's thinking. But no one dares voice. Harry's face flushed red, and his carefully maintained composure began to crack in real time. That's completely out of line, Harry shot back, his voice rising slightly above the conversational tone he'd maintained until now. My work with veterans, with mental health advocacy, with conservation efforts, these aren't PR stunts. These are causes I genuinely care about, causes that have real impact on real people's lives. Maher wasn't backing down. If anything, Harry's defensive reaction seemed to energize him further. But here's the thing, Harry, and this is where American Audiences differ from your British subjects who have to pretend to care about royal feelings. We can separate the work from the worker. Maybe some good comes from your projects, but that doesn't mean we have to pretend you're not also cashing in on your family drama while simultaneously playing victim. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and you could see Harry struggling to maintain his media-trained composure while clearly wanting to unleash a more emotional response. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, and his voice took on a sharper edge. You clearly don't understand what Meghan and I have been through, the racism we've faced, the institutional barriers we've encountered. It's easy to sit there and make jokes when you haven't lived through systematic oppression. That phrase, systematic oppression, seemed to be exactly what Maher had been waiting for, and his response came swift and merciless. Systematic oppression? You're talking about systematic oppression? Harry, you're worth millions of dollars. You live in a mansion in Montecito. You have Netflix deals and book contracts and speaking engagements that pay more than most Americans make in a lifetime. If this is what oppression looks like, sign me up. The studio audience erupted in laughter and applause, but Harry's face had gone from red to white, and his voice shook with barely contained anger. You're completely trivializing the real experiences of discrimination that Meghan faced, that our children will face. The British tabloids, the palace's lack of support, the racist undertones in coverage of our relationship, these are documented facts, not sob stories. Maher leaned forward, sensing that Harry was losing control and pressing his advantage. Look, I'm not saying Meghan didn't face some ugly coverage. She did, and some of it was definitely racist. But you know what? Welcome to being a public figure in 2024. Everyone gets brutal coverage now. The difference is, most people don't get to retreat to California mansions and million-dollar deals while complaining about how hard their lives are. But Maher wasn't finished, and what came next would prove to be the point of no return that would transform this already heated exchange into something far more explosive. And here's the thing that really gets me, Harry, Maher continued, his voice taking on that particular tone of gleeful destruction that his longtime viewers know means someone is about to get absolutely demolished. You and Meghan keep talking about being silenced, about having your voices suppressed, but you've literally never stopped talking. Netflix documentaries, Oprah interviews, podcasts, books, magazine covers, for people who claim they're being silenced. You sure have a lot to say and a lot of platforms to say it on. The studio audience's laughter was sharp and cutting, and Harry's face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. His carefully constructed public persona was crumbling in real time, and his response came out in a rush of barely controlled fury. That's exactly the kind of reductive thinking that perpetuates the systems we're trying to change. Just because we have platforms now doesn't erase the trauma of being abandoned by the institution that was supposed to protect us. Maher's eyebrows shot up, and his smile turned predatory. Trauma? Harry, let me tell you about trauma. Trauma is working 2 jobs and still not being able to afford insulin. Trauma is having your kid shot in a school because politicians won't pass gun control. Trauma is not getting the royal treatment you expected while living in literal palaces. The words hung in the air like a slap, and Harry's composure finally shattered completely. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising to near shouting levels. How dare you minimize what we've been through? Meghan had suicidal thoughts because of the treatment she received. Our security was stripped away, putting our family in danger. We were forced to leave everything we knew because staying would have destroyed us. But Maher was relentless, sensing that Harry was losing all control and pressing his advantage with surgical precision. Forced to leave? You weren't forced to do anything. You chose to leave, and then you chose to make that everyone else's problem. And let's talk about Meghan's mental health struggles. I'm genuinely sorry she went through that, but using someone's mental health crisis as a weapon against your critics is pretty manipulative, don't you think? The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow, and his reaction was immediate and explosive. He shot to his feet, his face red with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You have absolutely no right to speak about my wife that way. You have no idea what she went through, what we both went through. The studio fell into stunned silence. Even Maher seemed momentarily taken aback by the intensity of Harry's reaction, but his recovery was swift and brutal. Sit down, Harry. You're proving my point. The moment someone challenges your narrative, you lose it. This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior that makes people roll their eyes when you talk about being oppressed. Entitled. Harry's voice, cracked with disbelief and fury. Entitled. I've spent my entire adult life trying to use whatever privilege I have to help others, and you're calling me entitled because I won't let you trash my wife on national television. Mar leaned back, in his chair, his expression shifting to one of mock concern. Help others? Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've built an entire career out of complaining about your family, while cashing checks from American companies who want to buy into your royal brand. That's not helping others, Harry. That's helping yourself. The studio audience was completely silent now, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Harry remained standing, his whole body shaking with rage, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely controlled. You know what, Bill? This is exactly why America is falling apart. People like you, who think being cruel is the same as being clever, who mistake cynicism for wisdom. You sit there making jokes while the world burns, contributing nothing but negativity and division. That accusation seemed to hit Maher in a way that the previous exchanges hadn't, and his own demeanor shifted noticeably. His voice took on a harder edge, and his famous smile disappeared entirely. America is falling apart. Rich, coming from someone who fled his own country because he couldn't handle the pressure of being a working royal. And now you're here in my country, on my show, lecturing me about what's wrong with America? The arrogance is breathtaking. Harry's response came out in a torrent of barely coherent fury. Your show? Your country? This is exactly the problem. This toxic masculinity. This need to dominate and control every conversation. You can't handle having your worldview challenged by someone who's actually lived through adversity, so you resort to personal attacks and cheap shots. The mention of toxic masculinity seemed to be the final straw for Maher, and his response was swift and devastating. Toxic masculinity? From the guy who's made a career out of hiding behind his wife's skirts, while she fights his battles for him. Harry, you want to talk about toxic masculinity? How about using your dead mother's memory to sell books and documentaries? How about weaponizing your military service to deflect criticism? How about playing the victim while living in luxury that 99% of the world will never see? The words hit Harry like physical blows, and his reaction was immediate and volcanic. Don't you dare bring my mother into this. Don't you dare. His voice broke with emotion, and for a moment, it looked like he might actually lunge at Maher across the desk. But Maher wasn't backing down, and his next words would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of what had already become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become, Harry. She dedicated her life to helping people who actually needed help, and you've turned her legacy into a brand. You've commercialized her memory to justify your own selfishness. The studio fell into absolute silence, and Harry's face went white with shock and rage. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of pure fury. Get me out of here. I'm done with this. But even as Harry moved toward what everyone assumed would be his exit, Maher delivered one final, devastating blow that would ensure this confrontation escalated into something unprecedented in the history of late-night television. Hold on there. Prince, Maher called out, his voice dripping with contempt as Harry began to rise from his chair. Before you storm off like the spoiled child you've proven yourself to be, let me ask you one more question. If you hate the royal family so much, if the institution is so terrible and racist and oppressive, why haven't you renounced your titles? Why are you still Duke of Sussex? Why are your kids still Prince and Princess if the whole system is so corrupt? Harry froze mid-stride, his back to Maher, his shoulders visibly tensing. The question hung in the air like a trap, and everyone in the studio seemed to hold their breath waiting for his response. When Harry slowly turned back around, his face was a mask of barely controlled rage mixed with something else, the look of someone who'd been caught in their own contradiction. Because, Harry began, his voice shaking with fury, because those titles represent our ability to continue the work, to maintain the platform that allows us to fight for change from within. The system. Maher's laughter was harsh and immediate. Fight for change from within. Harry, you left the system. You moved to California. You can't fight from within a system you've publicly rejected. You want to keep the titles because they're worth money. They're your brand, your selling point. Without them, you're just another celebrity with opinions that nobody has to care about. The accusation hit its mark, and Harry's composure finally shattered completely. He slammed his hand down on Maher's desk with such force that the coffee mug jumped, sending liquid splashing across the surface. You have no idea what you're talking about. Those titles are part of who I am, part of my children's heritage. We can't just erase our history because people like you can't understand the complexity of our situation. The studio audience gasped at the sudden violence of the gesture, and Maher's eyes widened with what looked like genuine surprise before quickly morphing into savage delight. There it is. There's the real Harry. You can't erase your history, but you want to rewrite it to make yourself the hero and everyone else the villain. You want to be royal when it benefits you and a victim when it doesn't. Harry was breathing heavily now, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to regain control. You're twisting everything I say. This is exactly the kind of toxic environment that drove us away from the UK in the first place. The constant attacks, the deliberate misrepresentation, the complete lack of empathy or understanding. But Maher was relentless, sensing that Harry was completely unraveling and going in for the kill. Toxic environment? Harry, you're the one who turned toxic the moment someone challenged your victim narrative. You've spent the last 20 minutes proving every criticism that's ever been made about you. You're entitled, you're hypocritical. You can't handle criticism, and you use your family's pain as a shield against accountability. The words seemed to hit Harry like physical blows, and his response came out in a barely coherent rush of rage and desperation. Accountability? What about your accountability? What about taking responsibility for the damage you do with this platform? You sit here night after night tearing people down for entertainment, contributing to the very toxicity you claim to criticize. Maher leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to one of mock thoughtfulness. You know what, Harry? You're absolutely right. I do tear people down for entertainment. But here's the difference between us. I don't pretend to be saving the world while I do it. I don't wrap my cruelty in the language of social justice. I don't use dead relatives and mental health struggles to justify my behavior. At least, I'm honest about what I am. The brutal honesty of Maher's admission seemed to stun Harry into momentary silence, but when he found his voice again, it was with a level of venom that shocked everyone in the studio. You want honesty? Here's some honesty for you, Bill. You're a bitter, lonely man who's never contributed anything positive to the world. You've built a career on negativity and division, and the only reason anyone pays attention to you is because you're willing to say the awful things that decent people won't. The studio fell into absolute silence. Even Maher seemed momentarily speechless at the personal nature of Harry's attack. But his recovery was swift and his retaliation devastating. Bitter and lonely? Maybe. But at least I didn't abandon my family, trash them in public, and then spend years whining about how unfairly I've been treated. At least I didn't turn my personal drama into a multi-million-dollar industry. Harry's face went white with rage, and when he spoke again, his voice was a barely controlled shout. That's it. I'm done. This is exactly why discourse is broken in this country. People like you make it impossible to have honest conversations about real issues because you turn everything into a personal attack. But as Harry moved toward the edge of the stage, clearly intending to leave, Maher delivered his final, most devastating blow. Run away, Harry. That's what you do best. Run away from your family. Run away from your responsibilities. Run away from any situation where you can't control the narrative. But you can't run away from the truth. You're not a victim. You're just a privileged man-child who can't handle being told no. The words stopped Harry in his tracks, and he turned back with a look of pure fury that seemed to surprise even him with its intensity. You want to see me run away? Fine. But don't mistake my leaving for weakness. I came here thinking I could have an intelligent conversation with someone who understood nuance and complexity. Instead, I found a playground bully who gets his kicks from humiliating guests on national television. Harry began striding toward the exit, but his parting shot was delivered with such venomous intensity that it left the entire studio stunned. You know what, Bill? History will remember my mother as someone who tried to make the world better. History will remember me as someone who tried to continue that legacy. But history will remember you as nothing more than a bitter comedian who contributed to the very toxicity he claimed to fight against. Maher's response was immediate and brutal. History will remember you as the prince who threw away everything his mother built because he couldn't handle being second fiddle to his brother. Now get off my stage before security has to escort you out. That final insult was too much. Harry stopped dead in his tracks, turned back one last time, and in a moment that would be replayed countless times across social media, pointed directly at Maher and shouted, "You're everything that's wrong with American media. Everything." With that, Harry stormed toward the exit, but the confrontation wasn't quite over. As he reached the edge of the stage, one of the show's producers approached him, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. Harry shook off the man's attempt to calm him down and snapped, "Don't touch me." This whole thing was a setup from the beginning. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as Harry continued toward the backstage area, his departure marked by the sound of a door slamming, with such force that it echoed throughout the studio. Maher, still seated at his desk, looked directly into the camera with that familiar smirk and delivered his final verdict on the entire debacle. "Ladies and gentlemen, Prince Harry, everyone. Proving once again that you can take the prince out of the palace, but you can't take the palace out of the prince." When we come back, we'll discuss why sometimes the most royal thing you can do is act like a regular person. The studio erupted in a mixture of applause, nervous laughter, and shocked murmuring as the show cut to commercial, leaving viewers with the unmistakable impression that they had just witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history, a moment where royal entitlement met uncompromising American directness, and neither side emerged unscathed.